So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Sarah Berry, who we are so pleased has agreed to talk for us tonight. Sarah Berry, if you're on Twitter, you need to be following this woman. She's an active travel campaigner. She's the co-chair of Lambeth Living Streets and is a relatively new cyclist. So part of the positives of this pandemic, I suppose, right at the start was seeing the reduction in traffic. So Sarah's going to talk a little bit of her experience of quieter roads and link that to perhaps some aims or some of the positives of low traffic neighbourhoods. So linking it back to our meeting from last month and some of the stuff that we know is happening in Oxford around low traffic neighbourhoods. Sarah's blog, Diary of New Cyclist, if you haven't read it already, you should. It was award-winning. It won the Active Travel Media Awards in 2020. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and I'm going to allow Sarah to take over.
Wonderful, thanks Becky, and I will share my screen. Can I get a nod from you if that's visible? I got thumbs, great. Hi everyone, it's awesome to be here with you tonight. Especially grateful that you've made the time to sit by a computer on such a lovely evening. That's got me feeling very chuffed. And I'm excited to be talking to you tonight about my experience of becoming a cyclist and the role that an LTN has sort of played in that. If you had asked me a year ago even, if you'd told me a year ago that I would be talking to a cycling group about my experiences of cycling in a year's time, I would have like laughed in your face quite loudly and cruelly probably, because to me, I spent most of my life thinking that I would never ever be a cyclist, particularly one who rode most of their journeys in London. That being said, this is me. And this is my first ever bike. A few things that you should know from this picture. The first is that I've always been a big fan of pink bikes. I've always been a big fan of the possibility of using bikes for you know, journeys that might involve carrying shopping, or in this case, hypothetical invisible children. And I've always been a big fan of matching my outfit to my bicycle. At this particular time, I think I thought that this was going to be sort of the start of my massive, awesome cycling journey, that I was going to be, you know, hitting the streets and getting around with all of my friends in our little suburban cul-de-sac, and going on bigger rides with our parents, and sort of doing all of this sort of stuff that I'd seen the people in my community do. I grew up in quite a sort of small commuter suburban town in Australia, a couple of hours north of Sydney. And it was incredibly car dependent. So, you know, if we wanted to go to the nearest shop, say to pick up milk or the newspaper, it was about a 40-minute walk or a 10-minute drive. It was definitely not a place that was built for walking. And there was definitely not many cyclists about in Australia at that time. I think actually, you know, in my sort of teen years, Australia or Sydney was voted one of the most hostile cities in the world for cyclists. So it was definitely not the sort of foundation of a cycling journey that I would have loved to have had. And the other things to sort of know about me is I'm incredibly clumsy, I'm very anxious, and I have a very anxious mum. And all of these things came together in a sort of way that meant that very early on in my cycling journey, while I still sort of had my stabilizers on, my brakes did not work when I was going down a hill, and I unfortunately crashed into a friend at quite high speed and injured her and myself, which ended the friendship and ended my permission to ever ride a bike. So from there, I sort of just put the bike in the shed. As far as I know, the bike is still in the shed. I will check next time I'm in Australia. Who knows when that will be. And my sort of cycling journey was over. And that was the case until I turned 18 and I went to Cambodia. And one of the things that the hotel I was staying in Cambodia offered was a cycle tour of the city. And thinking of that old adage, you know, it's just like riding a bike. Once you can do it once, you can always do it. I was like, awesome, I will go on this cycle tour. And after I crashed my bike into a parked van twice before even leaving the driveway of the hotel, I realized that that was not true, and sort of nursed my injured pride with a cocktail by the pool instead, while my friends went off for their cycle tour of the city. And I kind of gave up on the idea of ever riding a bike. And because I was in Sydney, which at the time wasn't a very, wasn't a city you needed to cycle in, it was very walkable, you could get around, it was all fine, didn't seem like that big of a deal. But a few years later, I obviously moved to London, and came here, and all of a sudden I found myself commuting to work in Farringdon, and I'd look around me and I'd see my colleagues who had cycled into work, and they'd sort of like take their helmet off and like toss their hair like they were in some sort of commercial after having this glorious commute in, where they'd been in the sunshine and they'd been exercising and they'd been like chatting to people on their way in. And then there was me, who was, soaked in other people's sweat from having ridden the tube and just like mad at humanity. And I thought, this is not how I want to be starting my day every day for the rest of my working life. I need to learn how to ride a bike. So I took the TFL Cycle Confident course, the one where, a very patient and pleasant woman who is not paid enough money at all takes me into a school playground, and for 2 hours watches me fall off over and over and over and over and over again until eventually I can stay upright, and then put some obstacles in the form of little witches' hats around, or traffic cones, and tells me to sort of ride around them and gives me these little obstacles, and then acts like much more pleased than she honestly can be, and proud of me for managing to get around them. And at the end of those 2 hours, I could definitely remain upright on a bike, and I could definitely, move on a bike in a hazard-free and surprise-free area. But unfortunately, living in West Kensington at the time, just off Kensington High Street, it was not a surprise or hazard-free area. And despite the fact that I could ride a bike, I definitely was not confident enough to ride a bike on the road. So I would occasionally, get a Santander bike or like a hire bike and ride around Hyde Park or different parks like that. But for the most part, again, I put my cycling dreams on hold. But then this happened. I'd moved to Brixton, and at the very start of the pandemic, our local council announced that they were going to be introducing a series of low traffic neighbourhoods, one of which was going to be right in my backyard. And the day that the letter came through the mailbox, the day before, I'd been out with a friend who worked in a bike shop, and they were all cyclists there except for me. And we'd been sitting in the park, and they'd been talking about all of the things that they were doing on their getting around London during the pandemic on the bike, and I was sitting there sort of angry and jealous. And this letter came through the mailbox that said we were getting a low traffic neighbourhood to make it easier for people to walk and cycle. And I said to my partner and to myself, really, like, if I don't do it now, if this is not the thing that gets me on a bike, if I can't do it when my local council is literally changing the rules of the road to make it easier for me to do it, then it's never going to happen. So I went out that afternoon and I bought a bike, and this is me bringing my bike home. I wheeled it most of the way home because I was too scared to ride it on any road or sort of area that had any other person in sight. I did not know that I was going to be buying a pink bike when I set out that day. So I did not know that I was going to be coordinating my outfit to my bike and to my helmet, but that's apparently just how I do things. And from this moment on, I started trying to learn how to ride a bike. And for the first couple of days and weeks, that meant wheeling my bike to Brockwell Park, the local park, and doing on a Sunday morning before anyone was out there, and doing laps to get my confidence up. I still remember very distinctly the first morning, one day when my partner was having a shower, and I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if I could nip to the bakery and buy some croissants and have them back for us by the time he got out? Wouldn't that be nice? But I'm never going to be able to walk into town and get that and be back before then. And then thinking, oh, but I've got my bike. And then going and getting on my bike and riding to the bakery before I'd even realized that I'd never ridden on my own before in London, and I was on a road, and what did I think I was doing? And then was sort of back with the breakfast, looking incredibly proud of myself, before I'd even really noticed what I was doing. And from there, it was a sort of exponential journey from being someone who needed roads around me to be restricted to traffic for me to be comfortable on the bike, to someone who now rides my bike most days. I've ridden, you know, my biggest journey so far has been 27 miles. I was just saying, I've got a day of riding to Oxford in the diary that I'm building up to. And there's not many roads or many places that I don't feel comfortable riding a bike anymore. And I think I've got a nice little video of the summertime and here of riding in the sunshine with some friends around sort of Crystal Palace with, again, you'll notice, outfit coordinated with the bike, again, not intentional, it's just sort of how it happens. That, you know, this is just a big sort of part of my life now. But one of the things that I've noticed as sort of part of this journey is the fact that before I started cycling, the idea of being able to do the things that I do now every day without thinking about it felt like something that was genuinely impossible for me to do, like something that I would never, ever, ever be capable of. And now that I'm doing it, it's very difficult for me to remember what it ever felt like to feel like I couldn't do those things. Like the gulf between being someone who can't imagine ever getting on a bike and being someone who will use a bike without thinking about it feels massive, but it's actually not. So one of the things that I did in response to that, and sort of response to having that realization, was to start writing Diary of a New Cyclist, which is partly a way for me to sort of keep a check on myself and keep myself reminding myself of the fact that it wasn't that long ago, literally, you know, 9 months ago, it was June when I bought my bike, that all of this stuff felt unreachable for me, but also to be able to communicate to folks who are thinking about maybe getting a bike, who have got low traffic neighborhoods in their area or a new pop-up cycle lane, or, you know, have noticed that traffic is less during lockdown, though obviously that's not been the case in sort of recent months, but to think like, you know, this is something that you can possibly do too. So one of the things, I know that I'm speaking to a group of people who are likely to have been cycling for most of their lives, or it's been a very long time since they, you know, ever felt like afraid to ride a bike. But I wanted to talk through a few of the anxieties or the sort of what if questions that I had before I started, and how my thinking on that has changed as I've learned and I've gotten more confident. So my first biggest fear about riding a bike was, what if I fell off? What if I sort of, you know, did what I did in Cambodia and I crashed into a moving car, or I missed my pedals, or I got spooked by something and just let go, or like, what if one of these things sort of happened to me? And the reality of that is I do fall off my bike all the time. My biggest problem, I think, is the fact that I still ride really slowly. And a lot of the roads around here are cracked, and often I will find that my wheel will get caught in a crack in the road and my bike will stop and my body will just keep going. So most recently this happened to me. I was riding with my partner out to the Thames barrier. We both had a day off work and it was a sunny day and we thought that might be a nice journey. At the time it was my longest cycle ever. It was 23 miles and I was feeling very proud. And we went through Silvertown, where the Silvertown Tunnel is currently being constructed. And there were a whole group of these like very masculine, like very loud construction workers who I very much did not want to embarrass myself in front of or draw attention to myself of in front of, and in any sort of means. So obviously once I started worrying about falling off my bike, I become wobbly and I become a little bit more imbalanced. And I saw a cycle lane in front of me and I said, great, I'm just going to get up onto that cycle lane. And then I noticed a little bit in front of me that the construction workers had had a canteen set up for them that had been built on the cycle lane. So in an attempt to get off the cycle lane before I got on it, I managed to line my wheels up perfectly with a big crack in the road and fly off my bike right at the feet of all of the workers who were lined up to get their lunch for the day. There's my partner just like terrified and being like, oh my God, you're okay. And there's me being like, we have to get out of here as fast as we possibly can because this is mortifying. And you know, sometimes it'll be I'm trying to get on the bike and I get my balance wrong and I fall off. it's something that happens to me all the time. And my guess is that it's not something that most people on this call aren't familiar with as well. One of the things that I've learned since learning to cycle is, in my mind, anyone who knew how to cycle and was a cyclist never fell off their bike. And one of my favorite experiences of this tweet in particular was the fact that I got sort of hundreds of replies from very experienced cyclists and people who were wearing Lycra in their profile pictures, sharing their stories of the most recent time that they'd fallen off their bike, and they'd all been in like the past month. And I was like, awesome, this is great. It's not just me. And it turns out as well, you know, as I said at the start, I'm super clumsy. So like I fall over even when I'm just going for a walk. So really to be falling over when I'm riding my bike isn't that big of a deal. But at the start, that was something I was super afraid of. Another thing, what if, I want to make sure I haven't skipped one, great. What if drivers got mad at me? So as a woman, I don't know when I learned it, but I've always been incredibly aware that as a woman, one of the worst things that I can do is take up too much space. And I'm constantly, or have spent a lot of my life trying to make myself as small as possible. You know, I'm a big woman as well. So that's always been something that's doubly been on my mind, trying to make myself as small and out of the way and not a nuisance as I possibly can. And it was very, very quickly that I realized that attitude was just like completely incompatible with the idea of having a good time on a bike. Because if I tried to do that, if I tried to make myself as small as possible, if I tried to keep out of the way of drivers or you know pull over and make sure that people could overtake me and all of those sorts of things, that sort of generosity was going to be abused, and I was going to be put in situations that made me feel unsafe, or generally that, you know, it was going to make cycling something that didn't feel as joyful as it could potentially be. And again, drivers getting mad at me, something that happens all the time. I am a big like advocate of like taking the primary position of just like, which I barely even know what that phrase means, but that's what everyone always says to me when I say taking up space. So I'm just like repeating it like I know what I'm saying. But I'll always ride in the middle of the road whenever I feel like, you know, there's not enough space for me. And one of my favorite experiences cycling now, like one that will make me literally laugh out loud as I'm going, is when I have a car sort of like accelerate up to get around me and, you know, slam on the accelerator and pass too close and do all of that, to only end up having to stop at the traffic lights just a little bit in front of me and have me like pootle along and just like stop in front of them in the cyclist position, like in the cyclist box, and then have that happen again and again and again. And I'll always count how many times it's happened with the particular car or the particular vehicle, and just think like, you are getting more and more frustrated by this experience, and I am having a wonderful time, and just focusing on that and being, you know, truly okay with it being, with the fact that drivers will get mad at me. One of the things I was worried about is like, what happens if I feel unsafe? And you know, that is something that I've experienced and that all cyclists have experienced. And you know, for the most part, it's one thing I didn't realize when I didn't ride a bike is that if I don't feel comfortable, I can just get off it and walk on the pavement, which is never more than a meter away from me at any particular time, and wheel my bike. And I do that all the time if an intersection feels too busy, or if an area is particularly nice and I want to take it at a slower pace, or if there's a hill and I don't want to ride up a hill, which I very rarely do. But obviously in a couple of situations, you know, that doesn't happen. This experience I wrote about here was a particularly difficult one when I was cycling back from Kingston, which is about 10 miles away, and just had experience. I don't know if this happens to you guys as well, but for me, if I have a bad experience on the bike, it'll be like 10 bad experiences on one ride, rather than just like, you know, one every now and then. It's like it comes in droves. And after this experience, it actually took me, I think, like, you know, 3 or 4 months before I got back on the bike again. And I genuinely worried. I was like, maybe I'm not a cyclist. Like maybe I've been lying to everyone. Maybe I'm not cut out for this. And then one day I had to go to the library and I was like, 15-minute walk, no, and just like cycled there instead and was like, oh wow, look, I did it, it's fine. It turns out all I needed was a reason to get on the bike to make me do it again. But again, you know, that feeling of what if I feel unsafe, for me, it's something that you know, doesn't happen too often, and when it does, I feel absolutely no shame in sort of getting off my bike and walking it and doing that instead. And then the last one, which was a really big one for me, was what if people laugh at me? So, you know, as I said, you can see by looking at me, I'm a bigger woman, I'm a woman, I'm clumsy, I fall off my bike. And I had this really, you know, overarching thought that like, if I get on my bike, every single person that I pass while I'm cycling will look at me and think, who the hell does she think she is? Like, who does she think she is to be riding this bike? She shouldn't be out here and using her body to get somewhere or to have fun or to exercise. You know, she should be eating a pie or something. And that's never happened to me when I've been on my bike. Most of the interactions that I have when I'm out in the world is me being like, oh my God, I love your dog, or like, that's a beautiful dress, or how nice is the weather, or just sort of like chatting to people that I pass. If anyone ever has looked at me on my bike and thought, who does she think she is? I wouldn't have noticed, because I've gone past them, you know, so quickly. But people on the internet certainly think this. And there's definitely, you know, you can see in the tweet here, this sort of stuff is pretty representative of like some of the stuff that will come into my mentions every day. But I just am having such a good time that I don't really care. And it's one of those things, you know, I do think that there's a problem in the cycling space in general, that we talk about cycling as a weight loss tool, because, you know, anyone who is bigger will know that exercise, you can never exercise your way out of a bad diet, is the thing that people say, and exercise in itself isn't something for weight loss. It's great for an activity, but it's not going to make you any smaller. That's related to what you eat and how you eat it. And I think that we set a lot of bigger people up for feeling like they're not in a safe space, or for feeling like they're failures, by framing cycling as something that they can do to be smaller, because it won't be that. But what it will be is something that will make you feel like your body is capable of things that you never imagined that your body was capable of. And the fact that it can, you know, the fact that I can use my body, that tomorrow that I've got a meeting in Regent's Park, and tomorrow I will just like use my body to get there and then use it to get home again, is sort of like more than I've ever been told that my body was capable of. And something that, you know, feels like such a liberating idea for me. And learning how to cycle has been such a liberating and freeing process in so many ways. But I think changing that relationship with my body has been the biggest one of those. So yes, people will laugh at me, but for the most part, I just sort of, you know, don't even hear it over the sort of massive grin on my face of how much I'm enjoying being out on my bike. So that is me coming up to my 30 minutes of speaking time. But yeah, all of that to say that I've just found it to be an experience I never thought I would have. I never thought I was going to be, I say it all the time, I never thought I was going to be the kind of person who would ride a bike. And now I know that, you know, anyone is the kind of person who can ride a bike. So since then, I've spent basically all of my free time trying to tell as many people as possible, but also to advocate for measures like Low Traffic Neighbourhoods and other things that sort of made this transformation for me possible. Because if I didn't have that sort of space that I felt comfortable around my home, where I felt like I could gain that confidence on being on the road and riding a bike and getting around, I wouldn't be cycling today. I wouldn't be a cyclist without the introduction of the Low Traffic Neighbourhood. So I'm thrilled to hear that Oxford has got some in place, and from what I hear from some of my friends that live there, they say that it's really changed their area and they're loving it. And I hope that that's the experience that most of the people on this call are having as well. But yeah, that's sort of it from me. I'll go back to you, Becky.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really great. I realised at the beginning that I didn't introduce myself, and I thought I would introduce myself in the context of Sarah's talk. So at the beginning, I think Sarah said that everybody here has probably been cycling for their entire life. I think I didn't learn how to ride a bike until I was about 11, and I rode it when I was 11, and I didn't pick it back up again until I was about 25. And now I'm the coordinator of Cyclox, Oxford Cycling Campaign. I was the women's officer for the Cowley Road Condors, so it isn't late, and I think a lot of the things that Sarah describes. probably familiar to a lot of new cyclists, and especially a lot of new female cyclists. And I was really glad to hear you mention like about not thinking you were what a cyclist looked like. I know probably there's a lot of people on this call who might not even think of themselves as cyclists, because that brings up an image of a particular type of person in a particular type of clothing, on a particular kind of bike and a particular set of behaviours. And we know that cycling is much more than that. I wanted to open it out now because I can see from the chat that there are no questions waiting, but if anybody had a specific question, then probably now is the time to get that in the chat box, and somebody from the Cyclops committee will pick your question out. I wanted to ask you, Sarah, a little bit about that feeling of freedom and being capable, because what you said right at the start, you had the desire to cycle, but perhaps the infrastructure or the feeling of safety or confidence wasn't there for you. And what stuck out to me is that you said something about being sweaty and mad. And I thought, yeah, that was definitely me. I went through a sweaty and mad period, and then quite a sad period where I wanted to ride my bike. And then I realized how much people hated me being on the road. So how do you get past, how have you gotten past that, or what kind of tools or techniques do you use to keep getting back on the bike, despite having that period where you'd fallen and weren't so sure anymore? Something got you back onto the bike.
Yeah, for sure. I think that feeling of capability came surprisingly quickly, much faster than I thought it would, and definitely much faster than my sort of support systems and networks felt. So I remember there being a period of about maybe a month or so where I was getting frustrated with people because they would be like, do you think that you could maybe, cycle 15 minutes to this place? And I'd be like, oh, of course I can. But that also came, very soon after me being like, well, of course I couldn't cycle on this road that we've lived on for 2 years without you. That's preposterous. And it was like a very quick transition from one to the other. And I think what it came down to for me was, as soon as I felt like I had control of the bike, or as soon as I'd had a few instances when something surprising had happened and I hadn't, like, when you're new at something, you always have this instance of not knowing how you're going to react if something goes wrong. And as soon as I'd had enough experiences of seeing how I reacted when things went wrong, which was not to burst into tears and not to jump off the bike and not to do all of those things, I suddenly felt, capable of trying a lot more, a lot harder stuff. Where that fell down was that day when I did that big ride out to Kingston. And the reason that fell down wasn't so much about my experience, but about the experience of my partner. So I always ride in front when we go for rides together, because I still can't signal. I still can't take one hand off the handlebars, otherwise I fall off, and I'm working on it. But he always goes behind me so he can sort of signal for us. And in this particular instance, in this particular ride, I'd been close passed a lot. I had people come up beside me a lot. I'd had a lot of close passes. And I had just sort of experienced that as like, oh, that's something that happens and blah, blah, blah. But he was behind me and watching that happen the entire time. And when we got home, he was quite shaken and kept being like, oh, nothing can happen to you. Like, I'm really worried. Like, you've got to look after yourself. You've got to be careful. And all of these really annoying things that I used to say to him when he cycled and I didn't. And his fear of having watched the sort of close passes in me very much rubbed off on me. And I became very, very sort of frightened to do that again. And there were a few things that got me to overcome that. I think one of them was asking for help. So I was really ashamed for, the first couple of months when I wasn't cycling, about the fact that I wasn't on my bike. I felt like a bit of a fraud and a bit of a failure, and that like I wasn't as tough as everyone around me, and like I wasn't cut out for that sort of thing. But I sort of put it out into the world again on Twitter, which is how I deal with most of my problems. don't tell my therapist, and sort of said, you know, I'm scared to get on my, I had a bad experience and I'm scared to get back on my bike. And I got lots of encouraging messages from people that basically just said, like, give it time. And I felt like I really had to like keep cycling and keep doing it, because what if I forgot, and what if I didn't like it anymore, and what if it became harder, and all of those things. And it is true that the more regularly I cycle, the easier it is. But you know, as soon as the moment, like the months that I didn't cycle also corresponded with winter. So you know, it was winter, it was lockdown, the weather was miserable, and there was nowhere to be. So there weren't there was no push factor getting me on the bike, and the pull factor wasn't strong enough. But as soon as there was a push, as soon as I needed to be somewhere and I didn't have loads of time, that was all it took to sort of get me to do that. And I really do feel that like this is something that, now that it's in me, it's not something that I'm worried about losing again. And you know, maybe ask me that after I've like been hit by a lorry or something, and I might have a very different answer. But for now, it feels like, you know, this is who I am. This is a huge part of my identity, which is a huge transformation to go from when I used to be someone who like saw it as part of their identity that I wouldn't be like this. So yeah, it's been quite a year, really.
There are a couple of questions, Sarah, about the Lambeth Living Streets and the LTNs. Can you tell us a bit about those and how you're involved with them?
Yeah, for sure. So very soon after I started writing, I started talking about how much I was loving writing and how much I was loving the LTN and all of those different things. And a few weeks of doing that, Lambeth Living Streets got in touch with me and said, would you like to be involved, or would you, which at that stage looked a lot like, would you like to tweet from our Twitter account as well? And I thought that was very exciting, and remember calling my mum and telling her, and took that on board. And now I'm the co-chair with George Deacon, who has been there for many years and is fantastic. And we've sort of focused on sort of a strategy behind supporting the LTNs that has 3 strands. So the first one of those has been like creating a culture where it is possible for people to show support of LTNs and show love of LTNs. So like I campaign as a career. I work in protecting civilians in conflict zones. So a very different, I work in Yemen as my day job. So it's a very different sort of field. But one of the things that I've learned from campaigning over the years is the fact that people are very reticent to talk about things that they like, and people are generally much more vocal about talking about things that they don't like. So as soon as the LTNs came in, I knew that the first big struggle was going to be giving people permission and encouragement to talk about the fact that they enjoyed those changes, and that was something good and something that they wanted, and talk about how that was sort of, you know, impacting their lives. So that's where we made a bunch of like, we love Railton LTN colouring in pictures that kids could decorate during lockdown and hang up in their windows. I worked with a couple of others on the sort of green road open 2 signs that you might have seen around the place, that sort of, instead of framing low traffic neighbourhoods as road closures, talking about them as openings of roads for cyclists, for pedestrians, for wheelchair users, for children who wanted to play, for people who wanted to go for a run or walk their dog, or all of those folks that were benefiting from them. And we shared the sort of positive stories that we were hearing from all different kinds of people about how they were enjoying those LTNs. The second strand of that strategy was around countering misinformation and making sure people had access to the facts. So a lot of that was through Lambeth Living Streets, of sort of explaining what is traffic evaporation and who benefits from an LTN. We're using the road open signs in Oxford, awesome. And sort of, you know, also putting out the information that the council sort of was burying. So for instance, our council did an equalities impact assessment to think about how the LTNs were impacting people on low incomes, people of colour, people with disabilities, or all of these different areas. And they put it on their website, but you had to like click like 25 times through the website to find it. It was just like, it was this perfect thing to counteract all of the misinformation that was going out about it. And they didn't promote it at all, which is not their fault. It was like 3 people working on delivering the LTNs as well as communicating about them. But we tried to fill that gap, made sure all the accurate information was there. But the last one, and I think the most important thing that we've done as Lambeth Living Streets, is the fact that the best thing that you can do to support a low traffic neighbourhood is to use it and to demonstrate how much it's benefiting the community. So for me as an individual, that looked like talking about as widely and as loudly as I could how the low traffic neighbourhood had helped me become a cyclist and the impact that was having on my life, and how it was allowing there to be one less car on the road, and how it could be a solution for others as well. But it's also meant, we've adapted all of the planters within Lambeth to add benches so people can sit down. And then we talked to local business owners who were like, oh, it's great that I can sit down, but there's nowhere for me to put my coffee. So then we added little cup holders onto the planters so that they could put their coffee down. And then we heard that it would be nice if it was coloured. So we worked with a local group who painted the road in the middle of the night, in the middle of the LTN. And we wondered whether or not the council would be mad. But then the local primary school decorated their playground in the same pattern. So it created this sense that the local children's play area and the LTN were sort of one and the same. And this was a space that was for kids as well. And we supported local greening groups who have built their own planters and their own sort of like mini parklets and seating areas, and have made those sort of spaces pleasant places to be. We're working on a 10-kilometre running route through all of the LTNs in Lambeth. So it's like a thing, I'm an aspiring runner and have been my entire life. It's never going to happen. But it's nice to think that those road users who are legitimate road users have that as well. And it's a 10-kilometre route that cyclists can use as well. And basically we've, and then there's been things that have evolved in the LTNs that we've had nothing to do with. So for instance, in Tulse Hill LTN, which is where I live now, I've moved since all of this has happened, but only a couple of streets away from where I started. For Christmas, they did a 12 days of Christmas scavenger hunt for local families when we all found out that we were going to be locked down very last minute, where they decorated all of the planters along with that 12 days of Christmas song that has the like 5 golden rings line that everyone loves. So like they made a legitimate paper mache partridge in a pear tree that they put in one of the planters as part of the decorations. And they adapted the road open to signs to be orange with pictures of witches and pumpkins for Halloween. A marching band went through our LTN the other morning, and very recently a busker did a concert that when I was there for had about 50 to 100 people just like standing around what used to be a traffic filled road, listening to this woman sing I Will Always Love You, with cyclists going past, with like shoppers and runners being able to run in the middle of the road and not have to worry about the fact that the pathways were congested, and cyclists stopping in the middle of their journey and getting off, and a bin lorry, like a bin, what do you call it, dust cart still being able to get through, cars still being able to get through. And they're the things that make me so confident that when our local LTN is consulted on as to whether or not it will be made permanent, when they've surveyed local residents, they've had responses of 75% of residents in support of the changes. And that's because so many aspects of our community are now reliant on these being low traffic spaces. And, I'm passionate about active travel. I'm passionate about how people can get around. But the thing that I love most is community and livable spaces and livable streets. And for me, these spaces aren't ones that we should be able to sort of move through without thinking about it. They should be places where lives happen and where people live and interact with one another. And LTNs are a perfect foundation to allow that to happen. So that's sort of the sort of approach that we've taken here.
Thanks, Sarah. So I think the lesson there is, or what you are suggesting the lesson is to engage your community. There was a question, before I go to Andy, who has a question for you, I just want to bring some attention to Katie, who says, thanks so much for your talk. She was a nervous cyclist too, but she mentioned about managing the mixed reactions to the LTN. And I know it's a common experience that an LTN goes in and there's some the voices against it rise up to the top. And how do you manage that?
Totally. So I think that the first thing is to figure out who has legitimate concerns and questions, and who loves driving and just wants to drive unimpeded and doesn't want anything to do with sort of anything that will restrict that. So Railton LTN at the beginning was incredibly controversial, and was something that, it was one of the first LTNs to go in across the country as part of the COVID response, and people were really nervous about it, and there was a lot of vocal opposition. You know, I've been yelled at on the streets, I've had the police turn up at my house, I've had, like, you know, loads of like crazy things happen as part of all of this. Don't post photos of you out the front of your house if you don't want someone to use them to figure out where you live and send you death threats, would be my general advice. In saying all of that, over time, that opposition has diminished quite a lot, and we're starting to see people who were once really opposed to the LTNs who are starting to come around to them. So, for example, we've got a local councillor here who hated the idea of LTNs at the start and now has lost almost 2 stone because he started walking everywhere, and he is now feeling a lot less comfortable with being opposed to them. One of the things, so in terms of how I've dealt with that opposition, the first part is to figure out, you know, what of it is genuine concerns and where things aren't working. So the best thing about the way that these LTNs have been put in my opinion, is you can adapt them and they can respond to real world feedback. So, you know, the LTNs in Lambeth, some of them did create new rat runs, and the important aspect of that has been figuring out where that's been the case and then working with those people to talk to the council and say something here's got to change. So that happened locally in Streatham Hill, and the council, after too long, in my opinion, have just made some adjustments to that LTN to sort of fix that. One of the bits of correspondence that we had from older residents who were less mobile was like, it's all well and good that you've made this area better to walk on, but there's nowhere to sit down. And so that's where sort of parklets and benches came from, to make it possible for people who sort of had limited mobility or painful mobility the opportunity to go for a walk, but also take a rest every now and then, which, you know, is something as someone who doesn't have mobility issues, I just didn't even think about. The other thing is, anytime a journalist wants to do a story about low traffic neighbourhoods, or the Railton low traffic neighbourhood in particular, I'm very insistent that they come and do the interview in person in the LTN. And in my experience, there has not been one journalist who has come and seen the LTN in practice that has not been like, this is awesome. So, for instance, I had an interview last week with a journalist who came, and while we were sitting in the parklet doing the interview, we had 3 police cars with their blue lights on pass us in the hour that we were talking. And towards the end of the interview, he said, well, I was going to ask you about what opponents say about it impeding emergency services, but I've seen for myself that that's not true, so I'm not even going to bother asking about that. And in a lot of these instances, these things speak for themselves. Where we've gotten to with opponents to the schemes, which I think is a very good place, is we've gotten to a place where people are no longer asking for the LTNs to be taken out, they're asking for LTNs to be expanded or put in elsewhere. And that is something that I can very much get behind. So when there are campaigns that are like, well, we want quiet streets too, it's like, great, yes, let's throw all of our weight behind you and make that something that happens. And that's generally what we've started to see here, and it's giving the council here the mandate to push things further, but also to think about the fact that, as I said, people are much more likely to be vocal about things that they don't like than things that they do. And there have been countless surveys, like I've completely lost track of surveys of the Railton neighbourhood, and they all average around 70-75% of people saying that they support or strongly support the schemes. So I think people will get into well, this LTN is really unpopular mindset, but actually it's not. The people who are opposed to it might be louder, but when you talk to everyone, people really, really support these changes, and eventually opponents sort of get tired. And also, like, they sort of like, if you ignore them, which is what I tend to do, because I'm not very good at dealing with conflict in general, and people who are mad at me, I don't like also. But things like, one of the tactics that the opposition group here at the moment has started taking is that during the winter, we planted all of the planters with bulbs. So everyone went out, they bought daffs, they bought tulips, they put them all out, blah, blah, blah. the way at the moment that the opponent groups in Railton are expressing their discontent is they're cutting all of the tulips and the daffodils that have come into bloom and just like leaving them on the road, which just makes them look like awful people. It's not bringing anyone, like it's not making anyone sympathetic to their plight, like destroying nice flowers. And it sort of becomes clear when they start opposing things like, you know, parklets or flowers or different things like that, that people are like, it's very difficult for me to think now that you are genuinely concerned about, you know, a neighbour with a disability or something along those lines. But it was a hard learnt lesson. When the LTN first went in, one of the biggest complaints of one of the roads that was affected by it was the fact that they had a waste management facility on their street, and there was going to be a filter put in on their road, which would mean that instead of being able to enter or exit from either side of the road, they were going to be driving into the waste management facility by them and driving out again. Now this road has had, I think it's a 80% reduction in traffic in terms of the number of vehicles that are on that road in a day, but they were very upset about the HGVs that were going to be going to the waste management facility. And at the time I was like, oh my God, yes, like that's a stupid place for there to be a waste management facility. I'll work with you on a campaign to push the waste management facility to move. So I set up a change.org petition, I set up a social media account, we set up meetings with the waste management facility, all of this sort of stuff, and went back to them and been like, let's meet, let's talk, let's figure this all out. And then their response was like, if you really cared about me, you would make it so that I could drive to my house. And it became very clear that like, they weren't, that wasn't their concern was something else, but they weren't vocalizing what that was. And it meant that I had spent a lot of hours on a campaign that, you know, I do think the waste management facility shouldn't be there, but like, that's not my road. And if they're not going to work on it, then I don't have the right to work on it and sort of push that. You know, that's something I would want to do with the residents there. And they decided that wasn't a priority. So fine. I just made myself an enemy of the waste management facility, which like, you know, if I ever have to get rid of some bulky rubbish, I'm going to have to do it somewhere else, but that's fine. So thinking about, you know, getting the skills to figure out who has legitimate concerns and might be legitimately misinformed, and who is trying to sort of waste your time and derail you. So for instance, I've been asked to speak this Friday at an event for women in planning about safety concerns and LTNs for women. And they were like, well, one of the things that they sent me a list of questions and concerns that have come up from traffic planners. And the main concern that has come up is the fact that, well, what if a woman wants to go out for a night out and then wants to get a taxi home and can't because there's an LTN? And I was sort of like briefed on this morning, and I was like, sorry, what? Like, because they can't afford it. And they were like, no, because they're like, taxi won't go to their house. And I was just like, but there's no LTN in the country where that's going to be a factor. You can reach every house in an LTN by taxi or by car, like by any vehicle. And the fact that it's just like this misinformation is spreading, you know, so well that it is, you know, it's being covered in the BBC, it's being spoken about by MPs in Parliament, and now planners are like, well, this is the reality. So I think it is really important to make sure that you engage with some of the stuff that sort of opponents will throw at you, especially when it's wrong, and that's where that information aspect comes into it. And it is a talk that I am excited to give and sort of hear the different perspectives on. But yeah, it definitely requires some management, that's for sure.
It sounds like you've been doing more than your job's worth there in trying to keep, I wonder, because it has struck my mind quite often that it's easy to get swayed by the concerns that seem not so legitimate. So I think it's really good that you differentiate between genuine concerns and making that really work for as many people within that residential area or within that community. But there are some things that it is not about the LTN, and you aren't going to be able to solve by changing something. So the amount of energy that you pour into that, it's probably best to spend that elsewhere, like you learned with the waste management. I'm going to go, Alison, would you like to ask your question?
I will. So we had Lucy Saunders, who you probably know,
Mm-hmm.
who does the Healthy Streets in London and elsewhere, and she came and talked to us for an AGM, I think, and she said, "Do not mention the C word." That was the title of the talk, because cycling causes so much antipathy and so many people, and so if you're looking to create healthy streets, talk about what are the positives in a street, but don't say it's going to get more people cycling, because that will cause antibodies. And I just wondered whether things have changed for you, or whether you kind of declare you're a new cyclist and they've really it's made a difference to you. And
Mm-hmm.
just be interested in your thinking about and what your views are on that.
Totally. So I've written about this before, actually, and it was one of the more controversial things I've written, about the fact that people kept telling me not to call myself a cyclist, and I was like, that's silly. I want to call myself a cyclist. And I really do understand all of the ways in which that's problematic. What I would say on that note is, number one, I'm very aware that I'm speaking to a cycling group. So it feels like a safe space to talk about the fact that I'm a cyclist. And if I was talking to a different group, I might use different words. Before the LTN came into effect, and before I sort of understood what they were all about and all of those different things, if someone had come and said to me, well, this change will make it easier for people to cycle, I would have been immediately like, this is not for me, because I am never going to be the kind of person who can ride a bike. And I was wrong about that. Like I was just wrong. But I didn't know that at the time. And people who are wrong very rarely think that they're wrong. They think that they're right, and then they figure it out a little bit down the line. So I think that, one of the things I always try to say is that talking about imagination rather than thinking. So what I found is, if I say to people, you might not think that you can ride a bike, but you might find later on that you can, what they'll hear is me telling them that I'm stupid, that they're stupid. But if I say you might not imagine that you can ride a bike, that speaks of possibility and potential, and the sort of world that they occupy, and tends to leave people in a little bit of a less hostile space, and that seems to work better. But I think it is worth saying that, like what I sort of said at the start, that the gulf between being someone who can ride a bike in basically any situation and feel comfortable and confident doing that, and the gulf, and on the other side, someone who never imagined they could ever do that ever, for me felt like that's a big range of feeling, but it did not take much to get me from one side to the other. But I would never have imagined I could have made that leap before I'd done it. So I think when people say don't mention this as being something that's good for cycling, that's it. A lot of people will like sort of self-select themselves out of that criteria. I do think that we more broadly, low traffic neighbourhoods, healthy streets, livable streets, all of these different things, we always come at them from a transport perspective, because they are a piece of transport infrastructure, right? It's about how we use road space, and that's organised by transport departments. One of the exercises, like one of the brain exercises that I like to do with myself a lot, is like, what if low traffic neighbourhoods were a tool of the Department of Education? Or what if low traffic neighbourhoods were something that had been implemented by the NHS? And thinking about them from those sort of different perspectives. Now, obviously, as a group that's focused on cycling, we're thinking about this in terms of travel, transportation, different things like that. But we can sell them on a health perspective, right? We can talk about the fact that inactivity is one of the biggest sort of silent epidemics in the UK, and the fact that we need to make it easier for people to incorporate activity into their lives. So making it easier for them to get to the shops on foot means that they're exercising without having to make time to go to the gym. Do we talk about this from a mental illness perspective, where the ability to connect with members of your community and have relationships with people in your neighborhood is so important? Do we talk about it in terms of early childhood independence without the fear of children getting hit by cars? Do we talk about it in terms of elderly independence, people who can no longer drive a car being able to still get around on a mobility scooter or with a walker with ample space to move? So I think that when we do talk about these schemes just in terms of cycling, we're missing 95% of the picture of the potential of what they can be, which I think like we've got to take a multidisciplinary approach to these things, because they, like, streets are multidisciplinary things, even if we do lump them into transportation, and they have the potential to benefit. Like, they do have the potential to make life better for someone who will never ever ride a bike, regardless of what happens, who might be correct about that assumption. And, you know, it's not Cyclox's job to do that, but it is LTN advocates' jobs to do that. And I think, like, knowing your audience and knowing what they're interested in that regard is will help me sort of frame how I go into those discussions.
Thank you.
That's great. Taking a bit of a sidestep away from LTNs, I think Liz Bruton has a question. I'm going to talk for a second. So Liz, if you want to ask it for yourself, feel free to unmute. But before you do, I just want to point out the strength of the cycling community, which I think Sarah probably discovered from Twitter. Cycling Twitter is insane, insanely supportive. Any question you want answered, you can get there, and amongst other things. But within possibly seconds of Sarah mentioning that she was going to ride from London to Oxford, Liz had already offered Sarah a nice route to get there. So I think that's a nice testament to how cyclists and self-selected cyclists kind of look out for each other. I'm going to ask Liz a question for her. So her question is, what was your biggest surprise about cycling?
Great question, and thank you for the route suggestion, Liz. I'm excited to try it out and to meet some of you lovely folk in person when I do get to Oxford, as long as you don't mind me being very puffed and very sweaty and very proud of myself. So I think, like, actually, to your point, Becky, I think one of my biggest surprises about cycling was the cycling community. So again, like, as someone who was like, I am not a cyclist, like, I will never be that kind of person, I didn't expect the outpouring of support and welcome that I had from the community from the get-go. Like, I've never been laughed at by anyone in the cycling community. Everyone is so incredibly helpful. You know, I've met people who send me books to read, who, like, you know, I've you know, met and had conversations with and done all of this sort of stuff, who were, like, just genuinely so incredibly helpful and just seem like so excited that I'm here, like, just so excited that I'm a part of it and that I'm a member of the family and all of that sort of thing. And, like, as an immigrant to the UK, I don't have a huge community here, right? Like, especially, I don't have family here. I don't have a group of university friends. I don't have all of that kind of stuff. It's like, I've got friends, but they're in all of these different places. And then all of a sudden I started riding a bike, and I felt like I had, like, this community around the country of just, like, you know, hundreds of people that genuinely were rooting for me and hoping for this to be a positive experience. And I think that's one of the things that really surprised me, because when you're not in it, I think mostly what I understood as cyclists were people who were just, like, angry a lot. And I come as someone who is a cyclist now, and I mean all of this with love. But, like, you know, it was, if I ever saw content online, it was about how infrastructure had failed cyclists, or how they'd almost been killed in a certain situation, or responding to, like, terrible media coverage, all of which is very valid points. But that's sort of the thing that broke out of the mold. I didn't expect the joy, I didn't expect the playfulness, I didn't expect the generosity and the love. You know, I didn't expect to say, I'm too scared to go out and ride my bike because I had a bad experience, and have over 50 people write back and say, I'll come and go for a ride with you, and have me have to be like, that's very kind of all of you, but I can't ride right now because I'm too scared, and, like, doing it in front of someone who I respect and admire is just going to make this harder. So I think that was one of the things that was a real surprise to me. The other one was how much I was missing in my commute and in my travel day to day, that I just didn't even know I was missing out on. So, you know, like, as I said before, I'm a big fan of being like, I love your dog, I love your jacket, what's up that street, that cafe looks nice, I'm gonna get a brownie, all of that kind of stuff, that, you know, when it's like, you know that like sort of, you know, meme that you might see on, like, a background with a mountain on it, and it's like, it's not the journey, it's not the destination, it's the journey kind of thing. Like, it feels like I've really understood that since I've started riding a bike. And it's, if I'm going and doing something, like visiting a friend or going to a meeting or doing whatever, that event isn't the most exciting thing I'm doing that day. How I'm going to get there and how I'm going to get home is another really exciting part of that. And also, if anyone follows me on Twitter, you will have seen that this week I rode my first e-bike for the first time. And that was certainly incredibly surprising. I did not anticipate how much I was going to love riding an e-bike, mostly because it made me feel weightless. Like, it just made me, there was so little effort in moving, which is not how I experience movement in day-to-day life. So that to me was a real shock as well. And now I'm like looking at all of my finances to figure out how I can possibly set aside enough money to buy one. So we'll see how long that takes me. But yeah, I think all of those things, I expected cycling to be something that I endured. I didn't expect it to be something that like I would be riding along with like a massive grin on my face, like the sun on my face or my arms, or even like the snow and the rain or whatever. Like, doesn't really matter what the weather is. That like getting somewhere could be so much fun. I just didn't know it was possible.
I wondered how, because cycling in Oxford, I imagine, I've not done it, I don't think, well, not that I can remember, is a very different experience to cycling in London. But I know from my, because I started cycling in Oxford, that my idea of the geography changed. And I wondered how your experience of somewhere that you've lived for a time has been changed by you cycling.
Yeah, totally, especially somewhere like London, where you get around mostly underground. If you're not someone who drives or cycles, like for me it was always on the tube, so it was very, very hard to be able to connect different geographies together. It's made me realize that London is both bigger and smaller than I thought it was. So there's very rarely times when I can't get somewhere faster on my bike than I could by public transport or different things like that. And seeing how different boroughs and different places connect to one another has been really interesting. But the other thing is the fact that like there are so many places that I just would not go because I would have no reason to, that I've seen because I've gone for a ride, that is just so nice. And the other one is that like I think this also speaks to the sort of surprise thing. Cycling in my neighborhoods now is just so time intensive because I'm having to stop so often because I've seen someone that I know to talk to, which is like an aspect of the LTN as well. Like I like joke sometimes about the fact that like journey times double in LTNs because you run into neighbors so often that you have to allow half an hour to stop and have a chat. But like that, like I used to be able to go and get a coffee between meetings at work. I can't do that now because I am definitely going to run into someone and want to have a conversation with them. And again, like as an immigrant, as someone who doesn't have roots here, that is such a gift for me to be able to have that connection to place and that connection to community. But it's just made even sort of more profound as I see how places are sort of connected, and like learning about rivers that are just, you know, just south of where I live that I didn't know that they were there, and I feel like I'm in the countryside but like I'm 20 minutes from home, and how wild is that? And you know, different things like that. It's just like I often talk about one of the reasons that I moved to the UK in the first place was because I felt like my life was as big as it could possibly be living in Sydney. Australia is a very, very, very comfortable place to live. Obviously, the quality of life is amazing. The weather is awesome. Everyone's very happy and beautiful and tanned. But you're also very far away from everything. It's very isolated. And I sort of felt like, even though I was like 22 when I moved here, no, I was older than that. I was like 24. I very much felt like I feel like I've had every experience that I'm going to have, and I feel like the bounds of my life are as big as they're going to be, and I want to feel like my life is going to get bigger. And anytime I make a decision about whether or not I'm going to try something new or make a decision, my normal thought process is, will this make my life bigger or smaller? And I just feel like, especially during the pandemic, cycling has made my life so much bigger than I thought it was going to be able to, because it meant that I was no longer like, I've only recently started getting public transport again because it felt like, you know, there were only a certain number of people who should be using public transportation, and me wanting to go and catch up with a friend in Green Park was not a good enough reason. And that meant that like the prospect of being limited to where I could walk to was a really, you know, that's going to make my life much smaller, and it was a frightening one for me. And the fact that, you know, now I could see so much more of London during lockdown, I could have so many more of those experiences, but also like I'm about to go on a 3-month sabbatical from work, and I'm going to spend that time cycling around the UK. And it's just like, I'm going to cycle around the UK. That's crazy. Like, how is that something that I am going to do? And it just feels like, you know, well, when I'm done cycling around the UK, I could cycle around any country that I could get a bike in, which is all of them, as soon as I'm allowed to go there again. And all of a sudden, you know, there's just so many things that are a possibility for me that weren't before. And I also think about, like, as I get older, that being able to cycle and being able to ride a bike, that's going to be something that's going to enable me to be independent and move around a lot more. I think of my mum and dad now, who are retiring in that same car dependent suburb that I grew up in, who as soon as they stop being able to drive are going to be basically housebound, and think that, like, you know, there's going to have to be a lot to happen to me before cycling is out of my life and not something that I can do, and that's going to make so many things accessible to me. So yeah, it's just that sort of world getting bigger feeling that cycling encapsulates so beautifully for me, that has really unlocked London, and in a few months' time will unlock the UK, and I'll figure out how all the different parts of that fit together, which I'm really excited about as well.
I like how you relate that to that experience of lockdown, because I think it's kind of a general or universal experience of life having become smaller for a time. And we know just through looking at the streets, but we also know from the lack of bike parts and bikes at bike shops that there's a real cycling boom, or lots of people have gotten into cycling over this period. And I think there's 2 questions that kind of overlap from Andy and Liz, talking about tips for new cyclists, or what ways are there that we could get people to imagine that they might enjoy cycling? It might be an enjoyable experience, especially as we start to come out of lockdown.
I think representation is a really big one. You know, I'm a white young woman, so representation for me hasn't been a big issue in my life. But when it came to cycling, it really was. I didn't see many women who were like me cycling. I didn't see many bigger women cycling. I didn't see many people who didn't look very accomplished cycling. So I think, you know, sharing those stories of people who don't fit the mold, you know, thinking about, you know, I think a lot about, like, what TV shows do I watch where there are people who are cycling to get around? How is cycling depicted in advertising and all of these different things? I think that is a really important aspect. And I also think, like, I take my hat off to every woman with a child who is cycling, either pregnant or with their kid on their bike, because, like, they are teaching that child such a valuable lesson, but they are also teaching everyone around them such a valuable one as well, of, like, this is a safe and normal thing to be doing. And, you know, that's just going to get so many people on their bikes. But before I started riding, I would look at the people on the street, and I would try to look for people who seemed like they were somewhat like me. So if I saw someone who was, like, you know, had a basket full of vegetables and had obviously just, like, ridden to the greengrocer and were going home, or better yet, a basket full of plants, or even better yet, had, like, a takeaway cup of coffee, you know, balanced in one hand, I was sort of like, oh, like, you know, that looks familiar. Maybe that's something that I could do as well. And, like, people who were dressed, you know, in whatever, or looked like that they were having a good time, or had their hair down, or doing different stuff like that. So I think making sure that we're supporting as many different people to be riding their bikes as possible, realizing that every time that we're on a bike, we're sort of like a riding advertising campaign for cycling as a mode of transportation and a way of life in general, and sort of, like, being that, and, you know, having a smile on your face and sort of doing that there, but advocating for better representation. I know there's a friend of mine has been meeting with producers of EastEnders, to try and see if they can get some characters in EastEnders who use a bike as a mode of transport. And it's like, yes, that's the kind of thing we need. but also advocating for those infrastructure changes. So, you know, it would never have been possible for me without something like that coming into effect. And part of that, like, is about permission. And, you know, again, I don't know how much this is as a woman, but like getting that letter from the council that said, we are changing things so that people will cycle more, felt like someone was saying to me, like, you are allowed to be here. This space is for you. We want to make this possible for people who aren't super confident and super accomplished. And you don't have to like be assertive and in control and in all of these sorts of things to use this space. It's yours as well. So I think, you know, reiterating that permission. And I think a lot of the time what we try and do is we try and upskill and build the confidence of people who aren't sort of there yet. But sometimes what that can do is make people feel like that if they are nervous, that maybe they're not ready yet. And so I think like sharing more stories and being more open about the fact that these spaces are for people who are nervous as well, you know, which, you know, I think we do really well when we have like children who are just starting to ride, but making sure that we have sort of adults there as well is a really good way of doing that. I know that Joyriders is an organization that does this really well. And I think, you know, just providing those sorts of opportunities. Hire bike schemes are great for that as well, just giving the people the sort of opportunity to give it a go without having to make a huge investment. Maybe there needs to be like a day of cycling when hire bikes are all free, like you don't even have to pay for it, so there's no cost whatsoever. That might get people who would never give it a go the opportunity to do that. Might be the kind of thing that would get them there as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I think it's important to say that Joyriders is coming to Oxford, and I think Annette Pattinson, who is the brains behind it, is on this call. So that's an exciting something we're looking forward to. I'm aware of the time, and I know there are probably more questions to be had here, but I wondered, Alison, if you might want to mention something linked to Sarah's idea of representation and this like joyous image of cycling and what that might be in terms of what we're looking to do towards the end of the year.
Yes, well, I just want to mention that about Joyriders before we get on to that other thing, because we had Vive and Mariam from Joyriders here in Oxford on the weekend, Sarah, and they were talking about you because I know that you said you were, that you're going to help them with the social media. So they were thrilled to bits. And I also want to reflect on those questions that you raised. What if I fall off? What if drivers got mad? What if I feel unsafe? What if people laugh at me? Actually, I think those are all very relevant and pertinent to all of us, because I looked at those questions you set. That's not just about new cyclists, that's all of us. So there's obviously a spectrum. And but cycling with Vive was just an amazing experience, because she says, I don't care. And those are 3 words I've taken away from our ride. She is going to hold up drivers, and she will do it very beautifully, and she gets into engagement. So I think, you know, it was such a learning experience for me, and I think Catherine as well, and others who were on the Joyriders ride on at the weekend. Before I do that, Annette, is there anything you would like to say before I do wind up and thank Sarah finally?
No, sorry, just thanks very much, Sarah. It was really great to have an insight into the people who might want to come on the Joyriders rides. That's very helpful. Thank you. It's a great talk.
No worries, and good luck with getting it all set up in Oxford. I can't wait to see how it goes.
Well, and Annette's the motive force behind it in Oxford. She's been absolutely wonderful, and so we're very excited to have Joyriders here. So yes, and the last thing to say is that we are going to be holding a celebration of cycling in September. We've just started the planning. We've got lots of partners involved, like Active Oxfordshire, the City Council, British Cycling, the two universities. So we've got lots of people involved, and the aim is to do just what you've been trying to promote to us this evening, getting people cycling, inspired to cycle. So we're going to be doing activities in Barton, Blackbird Leys, Rosehill, the more disadvantaged areas in Oxford. And we've got lots of people already beginning to plan what they want to do. So watch this space, everybody, and we will keep you all informed. And in the meantime, Sarah, I just think that was such a wonderful, wonderful, inspiring talk. And we will have it on our YouTube channel, so we will be promoting it. So thank you hugely. Becky or Andy, is there anything more you want to say?
I think just to reiterate the thanks from my end, and I was just, as Alison was saying, inspiring. I've been cycling now for nearly 8 years, I think, and I still get really excited talking about it, and really excited hearing the enthusiasm of people who've discovered this thing that they didn't used to do, and how much they now enjoy it, and it's now so much a part of their lives. So thank you for coming to talk to us, Sarah.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great to hang out with you all.